My father, actually, almost coincidentally, comes from a village near Leicester, between Leicester and Derby, and Nottingham, called Attenborough, oddly enough. Though I never realised that until I was, I suppose, in my teens. He very much was a local grocer, son of a grocer in a little village shop. And he educated himself with scholarships, and one thing or another, took himself to Cambridge, became a don at Cambridge with a speciality of Anglo-Saxon and English. But he was at Cambridge at a rather difficult time when there were notorious feuds, academic feuds, which he couldn't bear. And he also believed profoundly in the red brick movement, as it was called, the moving away from the old ancient universities and into the new red brick universities. And Leicester had only recently been, within the previous 10 years, had been founded as a city supported entirely by the city. That was appealing in itself. He also said that he wanted a place. He had 3 sons. I was the middle one. And he said he didn't fancy his sons. He didn't bring them into the world to give to total strangers to bring up at the most impressionable and important stages in their lives. He wished to go to a good day school. And Wiggiston Grammar School for Boys, which was an Elizabethan foundation, would do him. So there were 2 things. Of course, I think primarily it was this new university college that was just being founded, just growing, just building, which was an excitement in itself. And also the thought that his sons would go to a local grammar school. Well, the building which the university occupies was, of course, what the Victorians called an asylum, a mental asylum for people who had mental problems. And it was built as that, and in rather noble buildings, which are only partly occupied by the University College. Indeed, one wing of the buildings was still in its ancient form, original form, in that there were cells, there were padded cells where they put these poor mentally afflicted people. They didn't know how to treat them properly. And my elder brother, Richard, shut me in one once as a joke. It was horrible because there were no handles on the doors, there was no windows, the ceiling was above, you couldn't reach it, and otherwise the walls and the floor were just padded. And that was the padded cell of the mental home, of the lunatic asylum. But the asylum itself stood in very, very spacious grounds. Lovely grounds, beautiful trees, which I climbed. I loved them. There was a lovely copper beech just near where our house was. We occupied the house that had been built for the superintendent of the mental home, the hospital. And there was the copper beech just on the edge of Victoria Park. And then there was a huge horse chestnut at the end. And beyond that, there was a paddock, just arable grass enclosures, which led down to what was then called College Road and is now called University Road. And so there were also very extensive cellars, which I think I knew more about than most of the people who were in Cambridge, in the college. Because there was a grating which I knew where you could lift it up, and we would go down with my brother and explore these cellars with candles and torches, and we knew where we could pop up in various places. So it was a very romantic place to live, and very spacious and full of, and it just had a common fence at the back with Wiggiston Grammar School, with the boys' school. And so we didn't have to leave for school until sort of like 2.5 minutes before 9, and could still be in the school assembly in time for 9 o'clock. Well, I became passionate about. I mustn't put this too high. As a kid, I was a collector. I would have collected anything. And did collect anything. I mean, bus tickets, which of course nobody has anymore, but bus tickets or cigarette cards. I don't have those either. But as well as bus tickets and cigarette cards, I collected fossils. And of course, the eastern half of Leicestershire is on the Jurassic, the Lias, the Oolith, and the Oolitic limestone there, which is full of iron as well, but is also full of fossils. The way of mining the ironstone, which was done in the 20s, I think, was that the beds are horizontal, so that you cut a section into the land, mined the limestone, and lowered the land by about 20 feet or more, and then replaced the soil from the top. So you would have these long faces of well-worn limestone. And the best way of preparing fossils is, in the early stages, is weathering. I mean, weathering just takes away the matrix, and you can see these fossils just sticking out of the rocks. And of course, there was a wonderful variety of those things, so that you began to learn very early on as a boy what the difference between this one and that one, which was the rare one. I'm not putting this high. This is saying me concerned about species or something, any more than it would be for cigarette cards. But I would know that if there was those striations there, that was a rare one rather than one that didn't have them, for example. And then I would collect them. And I remember taking my father, and he pretending to be ignorant, but understanding about education. I would say, "What about this, Father?" And he'd say, "Well, I don't know, son. I mean, you better find out." Where do I find out, Father? Well, you find out from books, and you can go down to the City Museum. And in the City Museum, there was a marvellous man called Dr. H. Gregory, to whom I'm eternally grateful. He saw this 10-year-old, however I was, and thought that I had some interest in this. So he taught me, and he taught me about the fossils, and he showed me how to look things up. He showed me how to distinguish even a broken fossil as to what species it might be. And in the end, well, I say in the end, but within a few years or so, I used to go to him as an assistant. So I would help him with collections and housing of collections. So I learnt a lot about geology, not from Wigston Grammar Schools, which at that stage didn't teach geology, but from Dr. H. Gregory and the City Museum in New York. You only understand ancient animals by reference to living things. So I was just as interested in, and I said it's illegal to do this thing now, but I mean, in my days, collecting birds' eggs was a perfectly reputable thing to do. I mean, grown-ups did it. I mean, responsible scientists did it. And we were sufficiently knowledgeable, I think, to know when we found a bird's nest, to know from how many eggs there were in the clutch whether the bird was still laying or whether in fact they were closer to hatching and so on. So if the bird was still laying, you could take one egg without disturbing it, which would replace it. And you knew that sort of thing, and you abided by the rules. And there weren't not so many people in the city, or so many egg collectors in the city, that made my activities any impact at all on the local avifauna. So I collected birds' eggs. As I say, it's illegal now, but it wasn't then. And collecting is a low-grade intellectual activity. It's quite true. But at the same time, the characteristics of collecting, the ability to look at detail, to know what is significant and what is not significant, that is the basis of taxonomy. And all the great 19th century biologists, or certainly naturalists, they were all collectors. Darwin was obsessed with beetles. And the enunciator of the theory of evolution by natural selection with Darwin, who was Alfred Russel Wallace, he was born on the borders of the Welsh borders, but he actually taught in Leicester School, the collegiate school in Leicester. And he was fascinated by beetles. And with Henry Bates, who was also a Leicester man, I think a Leicester-born man, and coming from a hosiery family, the two of them roamed Leicestershire collecting specimens and became absolutely obsessed by the natural world. So much so that eventually, after 4 or 5 years here, Wallace and Bates, with Bates, decided that they would go to the Amazon, go to South America, and collect and pay for themselves, because they were poor men. They weren't no inherited wealth. They would pay for it by sending specimens back, which would be sold to collectors. So the activity of collecting is not despicable. Looking from where we sit now, the zoology department is directly behind me in a lab that went down that way. And immediately out, and there was a very nice zoology lecturer called Dr. Hosko, Dr. Anne Hosko, I think. And she was doing research, I think, perfectly sort of amiable, non-lethal research, I hope so anyway, on newts. And I discovered that she was paying something like a penny a newt or something. It was, I mean, a real source of income when you had 6 months a week for pocket money. I mean, a newt, not bad. And I knew where I could get newts, and I asked her whether she would like some newts and would she pay the going rate, and she said she would. So I supplied her with newts. What I didn't tell her was that I was catching them in the pond that was only just immediately outside her window. So I used to make sure that I went catching newts in the evening when there's nobody in the lab to see me doing so. I suppose she knew perfectly well, actually, and maybe she was just being nice to me. But anyway, I did. Well, my father was I won't say he was remote, but he was quite austere, and he was certainly a disciplinarian, a strict. I'm not suggesting that he beat me or anything, but I had a profound respect for my father. And the moments when he unbent were precious moments. But the worst moments were when I had to take a report from Wiggiston School, which I knew was going to be awful. I mean, just dreadful, near the bottom of the class, and good work spoilt by silly behaviour and that sort of thing. I mean, taking this report to him, which he'd already steamed open outside some back shore, see what it said, so you knew that it was awful. And I would take it to my mother and say, well, I bought my report, Mother. And she would say, you better take it to your father. And I remember going to my father and giving him this report. He was at his desk. And he was, well, you see at the background there, he was already bald, I remember. And I remember he was quite a formidable figure. And he opened this report. And I thought, oh, he's got to this bit about my stupid behaviour and all that. And I'm standing there dejectedly. And he didn't say anything. Folded it up, put it back, put it on his desk. And he said, I wonder what was going to come. And he said, what have you got to say for yourself, my son? And I thought, oh, that's great. What have we got to say for ourselves? We've dismissed the report. This is a new subject. So I had to think of something quite early, urgently, to change the subject. I couldn't think of it. So I said, you haven't got much hair on your head, Father, have you? Of course, looking back now, I realised that he was about, to burst into laugh. But he said, you better go, better leave. And then I would have been laughing away. But anyway, he was a figure of great respect as well as affection. My mother was more practical in her upbringing. Both of them were highly social. They had a very strong social conscience. So he was involved in Rotary and I think at Chairman he was involved in the Literary and Philosophical Society. My mother was involved in the Soroptimists, which was an early feminist movement. She became a JP, sat on the bench magistrate. She was involved in the Marriage Guidance Council creation. And both of them were very much involved in caring for refugees. And the first ones were Basque children at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, when Nazi planes bombed the Basque cities, including Guernica. Young committees were set up in which my mother was involved to bring children out of these bombed cities, away from the bombs. And they came and they went to a hall outside called Evington Hall, and I think about 50 of them. And I remember the Evington Hall was disused, and I remember my mother said, "You must come and help me." And we went off to Evington Hall. She rolled up her sleeves and actually started scrubbing the floors, and I fetched buckets of water and poured around and cleaned up the place. So the Basque children were there for some months. I can't remember quite how long they were there, but anyway, my mother was much involved in that. And then soon after that, of course, there were Jewish refugees. And my father, as boss of the University College, was involved in a committee to get Jewish academics out of Nazi Germany. And to do that, you had to, in order that they could get visas and permissions and so on, he had to offer them a post. They couldn't come to Britain just anyhow. They had to be offered some kind of employment. So you had the phenomenon of very distinguished physicists and scientists being offered a job as a lab assistant in the little university college, which they took. And they came here on a piffling salary, and then got jobs elsewhere, either as doctors or as lecturers or whatever, but came through the university college, and that's how I knew several of them. And then, as a consequence of that, there was a special plea came through from one of the senior doctors, civic doctors in Berlin, who was Jewish, and could somebody in Britain provide a home for two of his daughters who they could come to Britain, they could then get a ship to go to New York and stay with their uncle, who had already escaped. And so several of there had been several of these before, but these two girls eventually arrived, but that was in 1939. And very soon after they arrived, the ship that was taking Jewish children from Britain to America was sunk by a Nazi submarine. And so all sailings were stopped. And the news came through, and my mother simply said to the three of us boys, well, boys, Helga and Irene, who've been staying with us for a few weeks, are now going to be staying with us for some months and probably years. So we've got two new sisters. How lucky we are! And I remember thinking, I'm not too sure whether we were lucky at all that, but we were soon sorted out by my parents, and so Helga and Irene became very much sisters. And they stayed with us until well after the war, when they eventually did make the journey. But the families continued to know one another for the rest of their lives. They're both dead now. But that was typical of my parents. He was a profound believer in the importance of learning. and the intellectual life. He, as I say, was the son of a shopkeeper in Stapleford, not far from Attenborough. So he came from very humble beginnings. And he believed profoundly in the importance of education at all levels, and of the accessibility of education to people of all strands of society. So his friends and therefore the family friends were all academics, really. One of the closest of them was a professor, was a young botanist who became one of the great botanists of the interwar period, Professor Harry Godwin. And I got a letter from Harry after one series which I'd done, in which he said, that he felt I was an educationalist and was just as much as my father had been an educationalist. And that warmed my heart more than I can say. And I think my father did think that I had remained true to the traditions that motivated him, in that education and knowledge was the right and inheritance of every kind and class of people, and that their lives were enriched the greater their education, and that everybody should have access to it, and that television, in properly used, could provide just that. And that was in the area in which I was working. And so I think he approved of what I did.